Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to a kind of rambling story time about the big secret I uncovered from one of my favorite authors. Admittedly, it's probably not as salacious as what you're thinking, but is it really a story time video if the title isn't at least a little bit clickbait? In 2020, I started reading the book Wildfire Griffin, and I have talked about this book and this series on my channel a lot. But for those of you unaware, it is a indie shifter romance all about this group of hotshots, or the firefighters that go in to fight wildfires, doing the standard shifter romance things of finding their mystical true mates all while trying to defeat this external enemy. I have both technical and personal reasons that I adore this book and this series. Not only was it the series I started reading in the very early days of foster parenting in a pandemic, and it saved my sanity, but it is also technically the benchmark that I view a lot of other indie shifter romances through, because this thing was fantastic. The core group of firefighters felt very much like a core group of friends. The dynamic was there, and while it had technically an alpha leader, it didn't feel like it went over the top into like that kind of werewolf hierarchy obsession. And the fact that they're shifters and firefighters could easily be so kitsch and weird, but it fit together so perfectly, mostly because they were up against a very big supernatural threat that also involved like wildfires, so it made sense that it was them being the ones focused on it. And there was so much different kinds of representation. The very first book had an autistic main character, and then throughout the series you have Black characters, Indigenous characters, multiple of each, and you have anxiety disorders, ADD, ADHD, and all of this stuff. And there's also a character, I believe it's called Turner's syndrome, that she has. Editing, Margaret? Thank you. And that was also very, very gratifying to me, because that syndrome, it mentions in the book, makes her infertile, which therefore proves that the true mate kind of facet of this world is not specifically inherent to just breeding, because people who are infertile can have true mates. And I love that aspect, and I loved the ending. And right as I was reading that series and like waiting for the last one to come out and on Pins and Needles, I tried to look up more information about Zoe Chant, because I'm like, I adore this series so much, and also I want to know, like, where did the rep come from? Did she have any of the things, or was she like any of the characters in there that all the rep was from? And I couldn't find really anything. The bios on the website and Amazon and Goodreads and all those places was the same kind of vague, she likes paranormal romance. Like, yeah, obviously. And I couldn't find much more beyond that. But, I don't usually deep dive into authors that I'm not reviewing specifically that hard. So I didn't think about it like too much. But eventually I started wondering, like, hey, when's the next series coming out? Because that Wildfire Shifter series has a sequel series that was teased at the end of the last book, and I love that series, so I'm like, hey, like, can we get that? So I tried looking up more info, still couldn't find anything. So I'm like, okay, I'll try reading some of her other work. And I realized something, and that is, it was really hit or miss for me. And I couldn't quite understand that. At first, I thought, well, maybe it's because that I'm reading her older stuff. That happens a lot with authors, especially indie authors, who don't have to wait and have 6 or 7 books under their belt before they're published. Sometimes their early work is whatever, and then something clicks, and they move on, and suddenly their work is fantastic. So I thought, maybe that's it. Maybe I'm just reading the old stuff before whatever clicked. But then I realized that no, this book came around the same time as the book I didn't like, but I liked that one. But also, none of these really feel like they have the same vibe, and I got really confused. And eventually, I started doing some heavier research, because I'm like, well, if this author is going to be an enigma, then I'm just going to have to put more effort in. and I discovered a fan page, VIP readers for Zoe Chant. And I was like, well, I don't usually do author fan pages. Not that I'm against them or whatever. For me personally, I just read too much to be equally invested in all of the authors that I read. I read over 120 books a year of so many different authors. I just can't sign up to that many newsletters or join that many fan groups, but I had so many questions about this author that I'm like, sure, let's do it. So I joined, and of course you have to state in the application to join what your favorite book is. So of course I said Wildfire Griffin, which, as I found out in the fan group, that series is like a pretty stalwart favorite of that author's community, mostly because you can see everyone asking, hey, when's Buck series coming up? When is that? Like, you get that question all the time. But one of the first posts I saw on that fan page revealed everything. Namely, Zoe Chant is not an author. It is an author collective. And that suddenly put everything into perspective, because one of the first posts I saw on the website was someone compiling which of the Zoes had written which books and which series. And there's easily over half a dozen, at least in that post. There could be others, because that post had been compiled by a fan in the group, basically writing out who else had mentioned, which of the Zoes had mentioned writing the various books. And that was wild to me. And that's what I was texting my friend Laura. I was like, did you know Zoe Chant's a collective? It's not even one person. She was like, what? And she was like, who wrote this series? And so I was looking back through the post, be like, it was this one. It was really fun to be like, okay, who wrote what series? And it also explained a lot, because I could kind of see okay, so these 2 to 3 Zoes have written the books that I loved. These 2 were the ones I was about. Maybe we don't do a lot with those Zoes as much. And it was just kind of a wild ride. And I'm not going to state any names of who any of the various Zoes are, only because I have only ever seen it referenced within this fan group that you have to be a legit fan, state your favorite book of the author or the collective to be in. So I'm not going to share names if they have not shared their own names, but I did find the name of the author that wrote the Wildfire series, and I started looking up her other works, and I found out that she had been traditionally published while back. She wrote a YA vampire book at the height of the YA vampire book craze, and it was quite amusing to see that just compared on Goodreads, and I think I also went and compared on Amazon just to see, but the love and attention from her traditionally published book to the Indie Shifter book, clearly being a Zoe Chant, a member of that collective, is doing a lot better for her, because the number of reviews and the review count was so much higher for the Zoe Chant stuff versus her traditionally published stuff. And the traditionally published stuff had been out for a decade and was traditionally published. And so I think she just found the niche in all of that. And that was really cool to see. I love it when, authors that are struggling in trad publishing can find the indie space that works for them. And there are other authors that have not even said their names to the fan group. It's kind of amusing that the fan group basically refers to the anonymous Zoes by the name of their most hyped series and then Zoe. So it's Shifting Sands Zoe, because a lot of them will have written multiple things. But in general, this was a wild idea to me, because I can't really think of another author pen name that is an entire collective. I do know of other pen names that represent two people. Kit Rocha, for example, I believe is a pair of authors who are friends. And then I believe Tiffany Roberts is the pen name for a married couple. But like, I've never heard of this in indie publishing where an entire group of authors, like 6 or 7, decide to get together and do this. I have heard of it for other series, usually traditionally published ones that are under some very, very shady publishers like the Warrior Cats or Vampire Diaries, where if the publisher doesn't like where you're going, they'll switch you out, or they'll hire a bunch of people just to put more books out. But I haven't really heard of this in the indie space with authors voluntarily all undertaking the same pen name. If you have heard of something like that, please let me know. I'd be interested to look into this more and look more into the logistics of it and how it would all work. I can see some pros and cons. The pros being obviously that you can have a much higher put out anonymity and brand recognition. So if you all want to write in the same genre, it makes sense that you can all market yourselves under that same umbrella. The downside, of course, being that the consistency can waver a bit. And that's not to say that one book is necessarily like really poorly edited or that I like super disliked any of the books that I wasn't even that big a fan of. But for example, in Wildfire Griffin, the Griffin shifter states directly that he cannot turn his human mate into a griffin, that a bite will not turn her. But then in another book, a Griffin shifter does literally that, turns his human mate into a griffin. So the world building can kind of change. There are some similarities, like the fact that shifters are basically a secret from the world. They have their own kind of hierarchy and their own kind of like justice system, and the true mates, whatever kind of soulmate thing you want to call it, stays pretty much the same. One look is enough, they know, and then the human does not know. And all that was pretty interesting, and I would have to probably read a little bit more from the other Zoes to get a better understanding of it. I just thought this was a really interesting story, that what I thought was an author that was just mysterious to me was actually a ton of authors. And I'm really excited because my favorite of the Zoes has not only that sequel series coming out, but has also written some other stuff that are more also shifter, but also fairy based, which I'm intrigued by. I had a big fairy phase, like so many millennials, back in my teenage years. So we'll see if this can rekindle that. But regardless, I hope you enjoyed my rambling story time. If you know of anything else like this, multiple authors, like more than 2, sharing the same name, I would love to hear about that. If you know anything about the inner workings of these kind of author collectives, I would love to learn more about them, because again, I don't even know how that would work. I don't know how I would manage to keep everything going smoothly with so many other people. Am I just not a team player? Is that what I'm discovering? Regardless, with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.